Okay, hello everyone. Today we have Dr. Kathleen Fraser with us, and we're gonna have like basically a really interesting talk. The title of this talk is Analyzing Patient's Speech with Natural Language Processing, or NLP. Dr. Fraser is an associate professor in University of Ottawa's School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Her research focuses on natural language processing, AI, and the social impact of these technologies, including how bias becomes embedded in AI systems. She has published on ethical issues such as bias in image generation, toxic language detection, and stereotype speech on social media. Stereotype spread on social media. Her work also applies NLP to healthcare, studying speech and language in dementia and long COVID. Long COVID. Dr. Fraser earned her PhD from University of Toronto and received the NRC Rising Star Award in 2024. Without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Fraser.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mohsen. Can everybody hear me and see the slides okay?
Yes, at least I can hear you.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, then I'll get started. So as Mohsen mentioned today, I'll be talking about my work analyzing patient speech with natural language processing. And yeah, okay. So basically the plan for today is to start briefly by talking about what is natural language processing in general. Then I'll discuss some of my previous work looking at language analysis for the assessment of cognitive impairment, as well as some ongoing work looking at different patient populations. And then I want to open up a bit of a discussion about sort of, is this a good idea? What are some of the limitations? What are some of the pitfalls? And what are some of the ways that we can use current advances in NLP, like large language models, to maybe make things even better? So I'll start by just defining natural language processing, which is a subfield of artificial intelligence, or AI, with the goal of enabling computers to either understand, interpret, or generate human language. And so this is why it's called natural language processing, is really to differentiate itself from like computer programming, like programming languages and things like that. And for a long time, this was a really niche area of AI, especially when it came to generation. It didn't really work that well, and sort of nobody in the real world cared about it. This has all changed, as you know, recently with the introduction of large language models and tools like ChatGPT. Suddenly everybody is very interested in natural language processing. And today I'll be focusing mostly on how NLP can be applied in healthcare settings. So when we think about language in healthcare settings, there's sort of three different groups that are generating or creating language that we might want to analyze. And so in the first category, we have clinicians. So clinicians generate clinical notes, EMRs, all kinds of information about the patients that they see. And so NLP analysis has been used to look at things like, can we predict the risk of suicidality after we discharge someone from the hospital? Can we estimate the life expectancy of cancer patients from the clinical notes? Can we extract different descriptions of the symptoms in order to improve the quality of care that patients are receiving, and so on? Another big source of language data when we talk about healthcare is researchers. Researchers generate a lot of language and text, mostly through articles. And so there's been a lot of analysis of medical journal articles trying to discover potential new drugs, to predict drug-drug interactions or adverse events, to extract gene disease associations and things like this. So analyzing the medical research has also been a really active area of NLP research. But finally, in the area that I'm most interested in is the patients themselves generate a lot of speech or language in other forms, such as text. And so NLP analysis has been used to look at problems like, can we identify signs of autism in children from their speech patterns? Can we detect brain damage due to CTE in professional football players through their sort of broadcast interviews over time? Specifically, when we think more about the voice, there have been studies showing that we can detect Parkinson's disease from voice actually over the phone due to sort of characteristic variations in the voice signal. If we look at things like social media, there have been studies looking at signs of postpartum depression from social media posts. And so here I'm thinking less of sort of speech, obviously, and more of like the words that people use, the kinds of ideas that they express, the structure of how they put their ideas together. And so this has been one area that's always been really fascinating to me, is how people through their words express what they're feeling, what's happening inside their body that might be hidden from the outside. And so I consider it a really rich source of information when we want to understand patient well-being. Now, I was putting together these slides, and they're actually a few years old, and I realized that now I should probably add a fourth source of language data when we think about healthcare. And this is that chatbots and LLMs are becoming like increasingly a part of the conversation. Any of these other three groups can and do interact now with LLMs and chatbots. And so that might be a fourth source of language data that we're really interested in looking at. And here, looking more at some of the recent headlines, we see questions about is the kind of health information provided by chatbots accurate and useful, or is it potentially dangerous and misleading? Are clinicians using ChatGPT or other LLMs to help them in their daily tasks, including things like transcription, but also maybe things like diagnostic support? And are researchers using ChatGPT to generate synthetic patient data, and how well does this actually represent real patients? And so this is maybe a fourth category that we can consider. But in this talk, I'll be focusing more on the third category of patient-generated speech and language. And so I want to start by talking about some of my research, which dates actually back to my PhD, looking at whether we can detect signs of dementia from speech and language samples. And so I'm sure this audience knows more about dementia than I do, but in general, dementia is a gradual loss of cognitive function to such an extent that it begins to interfere with a person's day-to-day life. And we're expecting in Canada and globally that we'll soon have this increase in the number of people over the age of 65, which is when the risk of dementia really ramps up. And dementia can have different underlying causes. The most common cause is Alzheimer's disease, or AD. And while there's currently no cure for AD, it's still believed that the early detection and intervention is really important, because it ensures the best possible outcomes for both the individual, but also for their informal caregivers, who are often family members. And so having this information early, having time to plan while the individual is still relatively cognitively intact can be really beneficial. And there's a lot of evidence that language changes can be a really important clue in identifying some of the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. So even though the hallmark symptom of AD is memory, or memory impairment, I should say, any change to sort of how you think is often ended up being reflected in how you talk or how you communicate. And so there's been earlier work showing that subtle changes in language can be detected, in some cases even years before the official diagnosis of probable AD was made. And just to emphasize again, when I say speech and language, I mean in the first case, like the audio signal, so the pitch and the loudness of our voice, how often we pause, and so on. This all carries valuable information on its own. But then, of course, we have the language itself, so the meaning that we convey, the words, the sentence structure, and so on. And I consider both of these sources in my research. And so just to make this a little bit more concrete, I'll start by discussing some of the earlier research that I did at U of T. And in this case, the data that we used actually came from a much earlier study. So in the 1980s, at the University of Pittsburgh, They were doing a study on Alzheimer's disease. And as part of that study, they asked all of their participants to look at this image, known as the cookie theft picture, and describe everything they see going on. And so they did. It takes about a minute on average to describe this picture. And fortunately for us, the researchers recorded all of these speech samples, and then they later made them available in a database known as Dementia Bank, part of the TalkBank consortium. And so what we did is took all these narratives, these short samples of speech, and tried to train a machine learning classifier to tell which ones had been produced by people with Alzheimer's disease and which ones came from older adults who were otherwise healthy. And so to give you a little intuition for the kinds of things that the model can learn from. So this is an example of what a transcript might look like. And we see, well, okay, this person called the stool a chair, which is a much more sort of common or like easily accessible word than stool. They said and ah a few times. This could indicate maybe they needed a little more time to think about what they wanted to say next. They started a sentence, but they didn't finish it, which could sort of point to some disruption in planning. We see that they repeated this idea of the water running over twice, and this might, potentially be related to short-term memory issues. And we see that they don't really mention the girl in the image at all, or the window and the view through the window. And so this could, again, potentially be related to attention. And just to be clear, like any one of these things is really not a big deal. Like we all say and ah, we all mix up our words. But the point is that when we put all of these little things together, the machine learning model can start to identify different patterns that might be linked to possible cognitive decline. So we used what at the time anyway was a very standard classification pipeline. We had these audio files. We extracted various kind of acoustic and prosodic features. We had the associated transcripts of the narratives, and we extracted things like part of speech tags, parse trees, and so on. We did some feature selection. We passed the feature vectors to a logistic regression classifier. And at the end, the classifier could tell us, whether it was more likely that a given narrative came from a person with Alzheimer's disease or a healthy control. And we ended up with an accuracy of 82% for detecting Alzheimer's disease from just like a minute or so of speech. And so this was cool. This was like a really great result. But, you take a great result from academia and you take it into the real world, and people have opinions about it. So I talked to some clinicians about this, and they were like, okay, that's nice, but like I myself can tell usually within about a minute if I'm talking to someone with Alzheimer's disease or a healthy older adult. So this is not that useful to me. What would be a lot more useful is if you could detect earlier in the disease progression that something's wrong and that we could intervene much earlier. And so following that, I switched my focus to one step kind of earlier in the disease progression, known as mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, which is where the impairment has reached kind of a point where it's of concern to the individual and possibly their families, but they're still, functioning more or less as normal. And so this is sort of an earlier stage that we would like to detect. And I did a bit of work on this in my postdoc, but then I also was working on a project on this at the NRC that I'll talk about in a minute. I also want to think a little bit about sort of how we design these studies. And so what we did in the Dementia Bank work, and what I think is probably most common, is to do kind of a cross-sectional comparison. So we have a bunch of samples from people with dementia and a bunch of samples from people without dementia, and we want to look for differences. And the problem, of course, is that there could be lots of differences that actually have nothing to do with dementia. So people, usually make some effort to match the groups in terms of really obvious things like age, gender, level of education. And we did that too. But there is always something else, right? Like it probably makes a difference to how someone speaks if they spent their whole career as sort of a teacher versus maybe some other job where they didn't talk very much. It probably makes a difference whether someone's favorite hobbies are like reading and doing a crossword puzzle versus something else. And so this idea of having perfectly comparable groups is really kind of tricky. We also have this issue of kind of variability. So if we assess someone only once on a single day, it doesn't necessarily give us a good sense of their kind of range of capability. Practitioners who work a lot with people with dementia say they often have good days and bad days, or even, a lot of variability within a given day. And so when we take this snapshot approach, we lose a lot of information about the variance in that measurement. And also, while, diagnosis is binary, dementia itself is, of course, a progressive disease. It slowly appears over time. And so this idea that one day, our participant is in the healthy category, and then the next day they're in the Alzheimer's category, it just doesn't really match with the real world very well. And so an alternative study design would be to look for changes within an individual over time. And this way, each participant accesses their own baseline, and we have a sense of where they're kind of starting from, and then how much variance is kind of normal for them, and start to measure significant deviations from that baseline as time progresses. And I think a lot of people agree that this makes sense, but it's just super hard. Like, it's hard to get funding for long, longitudinal projects. It's hard to recruit people to come back and give their data over and over again. It's hard to predict in advance who will show any decline over the study period. Even when we start with people who are showing mild signs of cognitive impairment, only 10% or so are likely to convert to dementia after a year. And so it's just hard to collect this kind of data. And I do get that. I'll leave you to think about that for 1 minute while we just enjoy this lovely image and give our brains a little break. Give you a couple seconds to look at it. And now I'll just tell you a little bit about a project that I've been working on more recently, which tries to address some of those limitations that I mentioned. And so in this project, which was a collaboration with the Bruyere Health Research Center in Health Institute in Ottawa, Carleton University, and the NRC, was to look at whether we can develop kind of a low-cost, non-invasive remote assessment for cognitive decline, which would allow sort of repeated assessments of an individual so we can establish that individual baseline and then start to look for changes over time. And the solution that we were looking at in this case involved both speech and eye tracking. And since we had this motivation of wanting it to be easily accessible and remote, we didn't want to use a kind of commercial grade eye tracker, which cost kind of upwards of $25,000. We just wanted to use a webcam. And so a lot of the engineering work that went into this project was actually just trying to get reliable eye tracking measurements out of the webcam. And then we also just recorded using sort of a regular microphone that you would find on a computer. We also wanted to design this series of simple, repeatable tasks that would give us rich information about someone's cognitive status while not imposing a large burden on the participant. So we've been doing this longitudinal study for it's been a few years of work. We haven't been collecting the data for a few years. We have 15 participants with MCI or early dementia and 15 healthy controls. And this is obviously not a large sample size, but the amazing thing is that they've all come back for repeated assessments. So we're really happy about that. We've just finished we did data collection at 0, 6, and 12-month assessment. We just finished the 12 months, and now we're hoping to also do an 18-month and apply for more funding to keep it going further into the future. We do a full kind of clinical neuropsych workup in addition to our novel assessment, so that anything that we see in the eye tracking of the speech, we can then tie back to clinically validated assessments. And again, we have sort of just a series of simple tasks which involve either eye movement, speech, or combining eye movements and speech together. So now, if you look at this image, I expect that most of you will realize that there's something different compared to when you saw it the first time. And so this is an example of a visual recall task. And if you didn't notice something different, probably you just weren't paying attention. I'm not saying that you have dementia. But we do see in our data differences between the patient and control groups in kind of a preliminary analysis. So the kind of colored blobs on these images show where the participant was looking. And so first they see the image with the umbrella. And in both the participant and the control, they look within that region of interest. So we believe that they saw the umbrella in the first place. Then controls on the right, when they see the image again with the umbrella removed, we see that they also fixate in that empty space where the umbrella used to be. And there's really nothing going on there. So the fact that they look there is an indication that they realize, as probably most of you did, that like, oh, there used to be an umbrella there, didn't there? Whereas patients typically don't look in that region. And so this is kind of a visual recall task. If you don't recall that there was an umbrella there, there's no reason to look in that region. There's also a flipped kind of version of this test where you first see the image with the stimulus removed, and then you see it with like the stimulus present. And so you can analyze both of these in a similar way. So that's fully an eye tracking task. We also try to sort of extend a lot of the earlier work, including my own, on cookie theft picture description to say what happens when we look at both the eye movements and the speech together. And so this is work that was done by one of our master's students at Carleton. I'm going to try to play the video. There's no sound, so don't worry about that, but hopefully you will see the video. Yes, the red dot is where the participant is looking at any given time. And when they fixate on a region of interest, so some important part of the picture, it turns green. So right now the person is silently kind of looking around. And now we see that they've started speaking. And so the ASR is recognizing their speech down in the left corner. And when they mention a region of interest, then it turns pink. And so we can kind of see this latency between when they first look at a region of interest and when they mention it. We can observe sort of the pattern that they take, first exploring the image visually and then kind of creating a narrative around it. We also see that there are certain parts of the image, like the dish towel or the window, that they looked at but didn't mention in their narrative. And so creating these multimodal features, which take into account both where the eyes are looking, but then also how the speech sort of follows the eyes, has been one sort of rich area of research. I'll also mention in this protocol, we have like a story reading and recall task. And so how this works is the participants first read the story out loud. And so we have eye tracking to follow their eyes and then also a recording of their speech. And then later on, after they do a few other tasks, they are asked to retell the story as best they can. And this is just speech recording. There's nothing really to look at it's just a blank screen while they're trying to retell the story. And so this also gives us some interesting information. With reading, we see that healthy controls have a smaller gap between when they initially fixate on a word and when they say it. We also see that participants with cognitive impairment tend to look at more regions of interest before saying the first word. So before they even start the narrative, they first kind of scan through and sort of scope out what they're going to be asked to do. We also see that participants with cognitive impairment take longer to read the story overall, either due to the sort of slower speech rate or more pauses, or because of this kind of like initial exploration of the scene. When it comes to recall, this is not, really surprising, but the participants recall significantly fewer story elements than the healthy controls. So on average, the participants with cognitive decline recall only one or two of the elements from the story, whereas healthy controls, it's more on the order of like 10 or 11, and that's on the first visit. So we're still just kind of digging into this data. None of the results that I presented here really make use of the fact that this is longitudinal data, but that's actually the thing that I'm most excited about over time, seeing, if controls stay stable, what does that mean in terms of the measurement? Like, are the measurements also stable, or are some of these tasks just not very good predictors of cognitive decline? And then, of course, within our MCI group, looking at how these predictors track with any of the cognitive testing. So that kind of summarized a lot of the work that I've been doing with dementia, and I'm still like really interested in this particular area of work. But I've also been doing some more recent work on other patient populations that I just wanted to talk about briefly. And this work has been in collaboration with the LARC Lab at U of T. So the LARC Lab sits within the Department of Speech and Language Pathology. The director is Tina Simic. She's really a big proponent, I would say, of using technology and computer methods to try to make some of what she does as a speech language pathologist and some of her colleagues to kind of automate some of their processes and make them a little bit more accessible. So one project that I've been doing with her is about long COVID. And so long COVID, also known as post-COVID condition or PCC, is this continuation of symptoms, or in some cases with the development of new symptoms, 3 months or more after an initial COVID infection. And I will get out in front and say that I know that this is kind of a controversial topic in the medical field, and this is sort of outside of my realm of expertise. What I will say is that I think in general, long COVID is not well understood. And so part of this project has just been trying to understand better and characterize better some of the subjective complaints that patients are experiencing and trying to really put quantitative numbers on some of these experiences. So this was a very interdisciplinary project. We had a practicing SLP, we had participants with lived experience, as well as a number of people with expertise in speech language pathology. And then I'm like the odd one out with the computer science part. So long COVID is associated with over 200 symptoms, and I think this is what makes it sort of not well understood. And also some people maybe have, doubts about the validity of the syndrome as a whole. But these symptoms range from sort of mildly debilitating to, in some cases, like quite severely debilitating. People can't work, can't complete their activities of daily living, and so on. The WHO suggests that between 10 to 20% of people who had a COVID infection may go on to develop symptoms that could be diagnosed as long COVID. In Canada, 3.5 million Canadians reported experiencing sort of long-term symptoms following a COVID infection. So it is, quite prevalent. One thing that I think Tina was most interested in is that people with long COVID often report communication difficulties. So they just can't seem to communicate the way that they could before their infection. And so language testing may hold a kind of greater sensitivity when it comes to assessing long COVID, but it just hasn't been really tested at all. And so she and I are very interested in this question of whether automated analysis of language can provide this sort of sensitive, low-cost method to identify cognitive and linguistic difficulties in long COVID. And so in the initial study, we had 31 participants with long COVID. They did an hour-long recorded online session with an SLP that involved multiple different tasks. But in this one, I'll focus on the 2 language tasks. The first is called the Test of Adult Word Finding, or TOEF. It consists of a naming sort of task where the examiner would show an image and the participant just has to say what it is. So they might show this image of binoculars and the participant has to say binoculars. And then there's also a sentence completion task where, and this is just a made-up example, but it might be something like, you use a broom to sweep the and then the participant will typically say something like floor. There's also a narrative language task, which is like the story, Cinderella story retell, where the participant would be shown a wordless picture book to sort of remind them of the story, and then they're asked to tell the story in their own words. Now, there are a lot of concerns, and rightly so, I think, about how culturally, sensitive this is. That's also a question for the end, but this was the protocol that was followed. So when we want to do the automated language analysis, the first challenge is always doing the automated speech recognition. And one of the things that makes this really hard in a clinical setting is that we don't want to send participant data to a cloud provider. We have no idea where the cloud is really a server somewhere, where is that server, who has access to it, and so on. So in this case, we use OpenAI's Whisper model, which you can download and run locally, so we can ensure that the participant data never left our computers. And this provides words and timestamps, but not speaker information, which was a challenge because we had to separate the examiner speech from the participant speech. It also failed in really unexpected ways sometimes, like it would recognize only the examiner speech and not the participant speech or things like that. So it's not, human oversight is still definitely needed, but it did confer sort of significant time savings compared to the SLPs doing all of the transcription themselves, which is what they had done previously. Then when we looked into doing the automated analysis of the TOEF, the most important information for scoring this test is whether the object is named correctly or not. And this is actually very easy to do. We just look at the ASR transcript and say, is it the right word or not? And whether the object was named quickly. And this actually presented a bigger challenge because the ASR transcript told us when the object was named, but not when it was shown. And fortunately, we kind of caught this issue early, and after the first couple of sessions, we had the examiner change how they perform the task. So they would, when they changed the screen to show the image, they would give a verbal cue. So like, how would you name this picture? And so then we could sort of hear in the audio sample when the picture was being displayed. And so this leads to a table like this. So we see, for example, the examiner in the first line says, what would you name this picture? Then we see the time that the examiner's speech ends. The participant says crutch. Then we see the time that the participant started their speech. The gap in seconds is available. The accuracy score is available. And so this is all the information that you need in order to follow the sort of guidelines for how to score the TOEF. And of course, we wanted to know, well, is this, accurate? So we assessed the correlation with the manual analysis. We had to remove the transcripts that were collected before this change in protocol because we weren't able to analyze those. And we calculated the Pearson correlation between the raw scores for each section, the total raw scores, and also something called the delayed response rate, which is when they answer the question but have a delay of over 4 seconds. And this slide just shows sort of, when we look at the base correlation, this is like what happened the first time that we tried it. And then we slowly made sort of improvements. So for example, it turns out that if you dig into the literature, it's considered acceptable to say sort of the plural rather than the singular. So there's an image of a rollerblade. It can be called a rollerblade or an inline skate, and you can accept the plural of both of those forms. There's also funny mistakes in the ASR where one of the verbs being assessed is rode, R-O-W-E-D, in the past tense of row, but sometimes the ASR would say rode, R-O-D-E, because from the audio signal, there's no context whatsoever. It doesn't know that it should be rode instead of rode. We also had to, there were certain ASR errors that occurred quite frequently that we had to account for. And in the end, in general, we're seeing correlations of 0.8 or above for all of the categories except section 4, which we're still kind of looking into. But it really gives us pretty good confidence in the automated method. Now, I'll just also mention, this is usually not the end for what the SLPs do. They then convert the raw scores into percentiles based on the age of the participant. And this assigns each to a descriptive category ranging from like weak to like above average. And when they did this analysis manually, first of all, they saw a lot of participants end up in the weak, very weak, or below average categories. And this cohort was very highly educated, and so this is not expected. Based on their age and education, we would have expected almost everyone to be in the average or above category, which kind of does support, the hypothesis that these people are experiencing real difficulties in word finding. It's also notable that the MoCA, so the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, is very similar between the groups. So these very coarse-grained cognitive measures like MoCA are not really picking up on some of these subtle changes, cognitive changes that people are experiencing as a result of long COVID. But the point with the automatic classification is that in 2/3 of the cases, the automated analysis led to the same category, which is because these small discrepancies that we see, that we saw like in the correlation, for example, don't impact this clinical assessment of like broad categories. And in the other cases, the automated analysis actually underestimated the capability because it was missing words that were recognized incorrectly by the ASR. So we're still working on this and trying to bring the automated analysis up closer to like 100% agreement with the SLP analysis, but it's really quite promising in terms of time saving for them. The other task that I mentioned, the Cinderella story analysis. So again, sort of from the literature, they have these very complicated schemas for analyzing this story. And this is why everyone still uses Cinderella story, because they have developed all these rules and there's all this normative data about how to interpret the story. But just to give you an example of one of the rules, they look for the concept analysis of Cinderella lives with her stepmother and stepsisters. And so there's rules about, can you use she as a pronoun instead of Cinderella? What are the acceptable substitutions for lives with? Can you say moves in with, for example? Does it have to be stepmother and stepsisters, or can it be stepfamily? So they have these very complicated rules that often refer back to other parts of the narrative, whether Cinderella has already been mentioned, whether the stepsisters have already been introduced, things like this. And so this kind of analysis, actually, I thought about trying to do earlier, and I could never figure out how to do it with the NLP tools that I had at hand. And this is one place where I think LLMs can be incredibly useful. So we have a computer engineering student at U of T working on this problem right now. About, can we use LLMs to do this kind of very detailed story analysis through sort of very explicit prompts saying, these are the rules, these are examples of when you can count it. This is an example of when you can't count this. And to output for every story element, a label of either it's accurate and complete, it's accurate but it's incomplete, it's inaccurate but complete, or it's just inaccurate and incomplete, or doesn't exist in the story. And so this is sort of the first chunk of the prompts that she's developing, but it's much goes on more complicated than that. And so just to give you, again, a little sample of what this looks like, the inputs, this is actually an input that she's using for validation. This is from a person with aphasia rather than long COVID. But you can see that they're not clean. Like, it's not once upon a time there was a girl named Cinderella, right? It's human speech is actually very complex and messy. And if you write down what you yourself say, you would realize how often you make false starts or use ums and ahs and so on. So the input is not sort of clean, well-formed text, but then the output is for each main concept. So for example, the stepmother or stepsisters were mean to Cinderella. It identifies the sentence that it thinks is closest to expressing this concept. It gives it a score according to the 4 categories that I mentioned. And then it also gives a justification to say like, okay, well, it mentions that she has to clean for her stepsisters. And this sort of implies that they're mean to her, but it doesn't state it outright. And so right now, Jessalyn is going through with the SLP students to really validate her automated system against their expert scoring of the Cinderella story. I will mention in this particular study, it was extremely easy to recruit participants with long COVID. There are a lot of people out there who are suffering and want to contribute to research, but we are still recruiting controls. So if you or someone you know might be interested, please reach out. As I said, it's just a 1-hour online Zoom session. But our preliminary findings do validate these self-reports of cognitive linguistic difficulty and suggest that language assessment might be more sensitive than these commonly used sort of cognitive screeners like MoCA. I'll mention too that Dr. Simic and myself have also recently secured a new grant to work with the Université de Montréal and expanding this analysis to francophone individuals with long COVID. So this is also, if this is of interest, please do get in touch. Finally, just being mindful of the time, I'll mention this very briefly because we just started this study looking at linguistic symptoms in migraine. And this was an interesting situation for me because Dr. Christine Lay, who's professor of neurology and director of the headache program at University of Toronto, actually reached out to me and said, a lot of my patients experience language difficulties or say that they have word finding difficulties right before they have a migraine, but like I can't find any literature on this, and would you be interested in studying this? So I was like, of course, yes. And so in this case, we are looking at linguistic symptoms kind of throughout the phases of migraine. So before, during, if possible, after, and then in this sort of interictal phase. So when people aren't showing symptoms of migraine. And again, coming back to this idea of using an individual as their own baseline rather than trying to compare them to other people. And the solution that we're working on in this case is this very short, like 3-minute long, user-friendly assessment that people can do online every day. So every day sounds like a lot, but it's like very, very short. And because it's online, you don't have to come into the clinic or something like that to do it. So we're really hoping, we're in the recruitment phase, so we don't know if people will do it, but we're really hoping that people will do it. So we have kind of just like a very lightweight symptom tracker, like, do you have a headache today? Yes or no? Like, did you take medication? Yes or no, kind of thing. We have a picture description task, a reading task, and then 10 images to name. And every day it's different. So it's a different image every day, it's a different reading every day, it's a different 10 images every day. So it should be repeatable over time. So I mention this only because I think this is a really interesting, like having this app infrastructure really could be tailored to so many different populations. I want to end with just like very quick discussion and then open it to questions. So always up until now, anyway, in my work, I have used this, what I would call now traditional ML pipeline, which is where you have some data from patients, you have some data from controls, you decide what features you're going to extract, you choose these features based on either the literature or, clinical experience or whatever. You think that you have some new idea that's going to be really cool to try. And then you just fit a decision boundary that kind of separates the groups based on the features. And the issues that are always coming up are, we always have these really small data sets. It's hard to know if the data is representative. Is it biased in some way? I mean, it's easy to know. The answer is it's not representative and it is biased. But having, really characterizing the extent of that bias is always difficult. I know in my own work, for example, we have almost always focused only on English. We've had a lot of questions about like, does this generalize for people who are speaking English, but it's not their first language? Of course, probably not. We've also always had very highly educated cohorts. I talked for a bit with someone in Brazil. She was talking about how when patients come to her clinic, like in many cases, they can't even read, like they just have a completely different level of literacy. So when I, collect data from a bunch of sort of retired public servants in downtown Ottawa, like, is this going to generalize to, people living in sort of rural Saskatchewan or whatever? And again, the answer is probably not. So this is always an issue. And it's something that I've been aware of for a long time, but not sure how to fix. Now, with LLMs, the pipeline looks a little bit different. So what you might consider doing is that, again, you have some patients, you have some data from patients, you have some from controls. Now you feed kind of the raw document to an LLM and you say, did the sample come from a patient or control? And you can improve the performance probably through clever prompt engineering, through few-shot learning, or other sort of methods like this. And then the LLM will determine, kind of based on the sample and the prompt and its training data, which is the most likely group label. And this is really tempting in a lot of ways because now we're not limited to sort of what we can learn from our very small data set. Like the LLM has been exposed to many, many, many more sort of examples than we will ever be able to collect in our small research studies. We're not limited by kind of our imagination in terms of what are the important features. Maybe there are other important things that we're not thinking about or that we can't pick up with our small data sets, but that LLM, can pick up on these really subtle features. The issues I think that we see is that we still don't know if the training data is representative or biased. And now we don't even know what our training data is. So that at least wasn't a problem with our small data sets. We knew what the training data was. Now, LLMs trained on the entire internet. We have no idea kind of what's going in there. We can't really understand on what basis the decision is being made. Again, with handcrafted features, we at least know, it has to be made on the decision is being made by analyzing these features. With LLMs, we really just don't know. And we can ask them for explanation, but there's no guarantee that that explanation is faithful to the actual decision-making process that it made. We also have new issues about how the data is being stored, how it's being used by the model providers, and big questions around sort of reproducibility and reliability. Like I ask this question today, if I ask it tomorrow, I might get a completely different answer, either because something about the model has changed under the hood without us knowing, or because there's just this inherent randomness and stochasticity in these models that's really hard to predict. So these are just some things that I want to throw out there. There's definitely pros and cons to both methods, and maybe there's ways that we can improve on our methodology when we use LLMs to avoid some of these issues. In the last minute, I recognize that I am speaking to pediatric surgery unit, and I haven't said anything about pediatrics or surgery, and I apologize for that. It's just not my area of expertise. Just want to highlight that, of course, similar work has been done on child language. Been really interesting work looking at autism, looking at sort of like classifying different disfluencies when children are stuttering or when they have like language disorders. And this information, and what I find really motivating, I think, about this area of research is that it really points to effective like interventions for children so that they can kind of improve their language abilities over time, which is sort of missing from my work on dementia. So just wanted to highlight in the last moment that hopefully this maybe stirs up some ideas in you that you could, look at populations of interest to your work. But that's all for now. Thank you so much. I hope it's been interesting. And yeah, if we can definitely have questions, or if you're watching this sort of after the fact, please feel free to reach out to me by email. I'm happy to take questions later on.